Hey, I'm Duke on Twitch. If you want to support the channel and greensunzenith.com, you can find my Patreon, merch store, and singles store where you can buy singles through TCG Player or Card Hoarder in the video description. If you want to get in contact, you can also find all that info in the description below for things like donation deck lists or just wanting to reach out. Alright, let's get right into it.
Hey team, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. Back today with a small deck around what I'm most likely taking to God of Legacy. God of Legacy is a legacy tournament based at Haruya in Tokyo, Japan. I believe it runs once a quarter. It's a pretty big tournament, which is nice. And luckily for my trip to Japan, I'll be there when it's on. So going to take the day to play in the event. And I had two choices in my head. I had Naya Depths and I had Abzan Maverick. The pros of Naya Depths were that it is still a grindy deck, still a Green Suns deck, still a deck definitely still in my wheelhouse, and it has a few built-in win conditions that are a little bit quicker than Maverick. Obviously having the I win button of Maritlage is very strong, and having a lot of ways to hold it up at instant speed to see if you can just end step it and then get through with attacks in the next turn is really appealing for a big event, a long day, and of course an unknown metagame as well. By playing in an unknown metagame, it's a lot harder to target decks with a deck like Abzan Maverick because your tutor targets, your silver bullets, have to line up in the blind. You're not too sure what you're going to come across. Is Plague Engineer actually going to be worth it? Is Collect Oof going to be worth it? Is this an event where the red splash is better? A lot of questions around Maverick, and Depths doesn't have that as much. I think that Depths just having the ability to even combo off on turn 2 to attack on turn 3 is really powerful, especially when you want to go into a tournament probably with the ability to say, well, if my opponent's strategy doesn't go off by X turn, I'm just going to combo them and see if they have any sort of interaction. You also have a few more interactions with Depths due to Mox Diamond, Mana Acceleration in that way. Crop Rotation for Bojuka Bog or Karakas can sometimes just lead to automatic wins as well, which is really nice. Obviously, Minsk and Boo is a very hard card to interact with for some decks, and can just be another win condition that can run away with the game on its own. So Naya Depths being a deck that I have got a few reps under my belt with was a pretty big consideration. Pyroblast as well. From what I've heard about the Japanese metagame, there's a lot of brewing, and I feel like a lot of Mox Diamond decks, so I wasn't too sure about Pyroblast and how big of a factor having access to blast effects would be. But speaking to a few people, there's definitely a blue segment of the metagame that's pretty good. But it's really tough. I think my head says Naya, but my heart says Maverick. And I put up a tweet on Twitter. I put up a poll looking at what should I play? Naya Depths, Abzan Maverick. And the defining thought was, if I had to go with Naya Depths, I'd probably feel pretty sad. If I hit Maverick, I wouldn't be. And I think that's the big one. I think it comes down to I'd probably have more fun with Maverick, and I'd probably regret not choosing Maverick if I did poorly with Naya, but I don't necessarily think I would have the same feelings if I took Maverick and didn't perform and thought, what about Naya? So I've landed on Maverick, which is pretty cool. This is very close to Achilles' list that we played recently on the stream. It should be up on YouTube very soon. And also pretty close to Dan Neely's list that won the Legacy Challenge. Obviously, Dan's list was not playing Once Upon a Time, a card that Hello Newton was very keen on to get into Maverick now that Fiend Artisan has performing really well. And Achilles had a really nice version. It's very close to it. The only difference is I'm not playing a third Endurance in the board or a third Thoughtseize. No, sorry. I'm not playing a third Endurance or a second Plague Engineer in the board. I'm running 2 Deafening Silence on top of 2 Thoughtseize for combo decks. And that was really just because I think this deck has a really good mid-range and creature matchup. And it's really going to be combo that probably gives this deck some amount of grief, especially in the early turns. So having turn 0 interaction in Surgical, Endurance, and Force of Vigor, and turn 1 interaction in Deafening Silence and Thoughtseize is really nice. I do think Thoughtseize is great. I'm a big fan of Thoughtseize. There are obviously metagames and shifts over years in the Legacy metagame that have kind of pushed Thoughtseize away. And the big thing for that is there's been many a times where I've Thoughtseized my combo opponent on turn 1, taken their best card, and then they've just either ripped the same card or ripped a card very close to it that's allowed them to go off on the same turn anyway. Deafening Silence at least makes them have to have an answer for it, and if not, it does have an ongoing effect on your opponent's turns over more than one turn. So Thoughtseize is obviously great as a 1-for-1, see if the coast is clear, get some information about what you want a Green Suns for, how you want a Wasteland, etc. Deafening Silence, a little bit better in different ways, in that it might affect your opponent on more than one turn. So I really like the mix. I think they come in against different decks as well. Maybe against some Stoneblade decks, I'll be happy to bring in the Thoughtseizes. And against decks like 8-cast, I'd be happy to bring in the Deafening Silences. The only real thought for this deck was main deck Liberator over Night of Autumn and switching those, because I do like that Night of Autumn leaves a body behind after its ability. We do already have some pretty nice 2-drops in Fiend Artisan just to search for if we're not looking for a bear like Liberator or Oof, but I'm still going back and forth on that. I'm very much against having, I guess, soft bullets in the board. I don't think Liberator is worth it as a sideboard bullet in the board, and would probably run something like another Force of Vigor, or potentially something like Seed of Innocence, where it's just got that really large amount of impact. But I still think there's a lot of advantage to running Liberator, getting it to flip, and forcing your opponent to deal with it, probably in a poor resource trade, which is quite nice, and really where you want to get your opponent with Maverick. I've been really impressed by this build. Esper Sentinel has probably been one of the best cards, especially Esper Sentinel into Thalia, giving you a really nice turn 1, turn 2 play instead of just the classic mana acceleration into Night or something similar. Esper Sentinel has drawn up to 5 to 6 cards in some matchups, and especially combo. If you're needing that one draw into Surgical or Endurance or Force of Vigor, Esper Sentinel is just so good at giving you more outs to that. And obviously with things like Exalted in the deck, you do get chances to attack first, make Esper Sentinel bigger, and then if your opponent wants to respond to anything in your second main when you're casting spells, they obviously have to pay more, which they might not be able to, which allows you to keep drawing cards. So moves away from Sylvan Library as card advantage. Nothing like Tireless Tracker in this matchup, or in this decklist, sorry. But Esper Sentinel, really strong. And obviously with Fiend Artisan, you also just get the chance to, once your opponent has developed their mana, is probably in a position where they're never going to pay for it again, you have it to throw away for something like a Grist or a Palace Jailer to really either keep an advantage going or keep that card draw going. I think I'm still happy with the Jailer and the Engineer in the main deck, along with the Questing Beast. I know Newton's had some thoughts about cutting the 4-drops and adding in more, say, an extra Esper Sentinel and an extra Mana Dork. But I really like having those as kind of the end game, not just in terms of the actual game and where you usually end up, but also as targets for Fiend Artisan. Without those, it's pretty tough to have a really impactful sort of end of Zenith or end of Fiend Artisan threat outside of Grist or Knight. And the Plague Engineer and the Palace Jailer just give you some outs to matches where you really need it. So against maybe Death and Taxes, after turn 1 Mum, where you don't have the sword straight up, you obviously don't want to 2-for-1 yourself. So moving towards Plague Engineer to just take out the Mum is putting you in a pretty nice spot. I think this deck is pretty well positioned for an open metagame, but it's going to be, you know, tough to say. I really like the 23 lands along with Once Upon a Time. I found that the 4 mana dogs and Dryad Arbor was more than enough as well. The Kaya in the board might seem off as a one-of, because you're not really going to see it too much, but this card really performs when you see it. It gives you the ability to reset creatures like Plague Engineer, like Endurance, like Knight of Autumn, like Palace Jailer, which is great. The 0 gets rid of constructs and other tokens. It also takes creatures off the board until the beginning of your next upkeep, which means if your opponent plays a mum and you don't have an answer for it, you can exile it a whole turn to keep it summoning sick, which is very cool. Also, straight away, it goes from 5 to 3. Your opponent discards a card, you draw a card, and then if your opponent, even if they answer it 1 for 1, they're still down in that trade, which is just mind-boggling. But the ability to neg 2, and then 0, to draw 2 cards, your opponent discards 2 cards, and then Kaya comes back as a 5 loyalty Planeswalker, is pretty absurd. Obviously, by then you're probably in a great position, but Kaya's been great. And although it might make sense to try to find another Green Suns target, like Undermounted Adventurer, which also provides a lot of advantage, can be found through Green Suns or Fiend. Kaya, I think, is just really nice in this deck, because it's all about kind of changing up the different ways that we can attack our opponent, either through creatures, our mana base, planeswalkers. Obviously, Thoughtseize adds stack abilities, which is really nice. You know, enchantments through Deafening Silence. It's really about providing that disruption and pressure in different types of permanents. So something like an Echoing Truth or a board wipe for creatures just doesn't hit every single thing that is disrupting our opponent. But yeah, I think this is going to be a sweet deck to take into the event. And I think by playing Maverick, I'm also going to be a little bit more calm, just knowing what to play. Obviously, in paper and with Naya Depths, you can play Morlock, which I do have in my 75 as like a 2 of. So without any real experience with that build, that's also a slight contention on why I think Abzan Maverick might just be the better deck to play. So yeah, we'll see how this goes. Nothing else really to cover. I think I would love to be playing against other Depths decks. I definitely don't mind 8-cast. Having some matchups where you can get those free wins of something like turn 2 Collector Oof, or Thalia into Wasteland, or Plague Engineer just being really good against tribal decks. You know, Questing Bees can be great against decks like lands if they're trying to rely on Mazevits to keep your creatures at bay. You know, Ramanap with Wasteland is still a good lock. I think it's going to be pretty great as a mid to late game deck, especially with Palace Jailer and Grist. So my board being mostly of 1 mana or 3 mana spells is where I want to be. I want to be able to interact with my combo opponents on turn 0 and on turn 1. And I want to have ways that I can deploy creatures but still hold up interaction in things like Surgical or Force of Vigor. So we'll see how this goes. Hope you guys enjoyed this quick deck tech. Of course, if you're going to be at God of Legacy, come say hey. I'd love to chat. And I'll probably do a little review after the event and go through how it went. Until then, a big thanks. We'll catch you next time.